So we're going to work on this one today and finish it up. And that crunching that you hear, that is J. So I'm using a ballpoint pen, a water-soluble pen, another ballpoint, some white gouache, and then my sparkly watercolors. I haven't used these very much, so I want to play with them. And I'm going to use mainly green. And I got my bro with me. And so a little history. I began this early morning one day, and all I'm doing is I'm going back into my journal and I'm writing, and I'm adding writing, and then I'm going to draw over the top. So this pen I'm using is just a ballpoint pen, and I keep refilling it. I've had this pen for like 7 years when I was a waitress. Going back to school as an adult, I waited tables, and I use this pen to take orders. So I use it when I journal, and it keeps me going. And right now, swirls and flowers and more swirls, and it's just chicken scratch and scumbling. But that tape is DIY tape, and we can make that if you want to do that. So it's just a piece of map, and I'm tying it in. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over the top of the drawing, and I did add color pencil off camera, but I'm going to go back over the top with some gouache. And I haven't used gouache in a long time because I just didn't like it, but I figured out how I like it. I do glazes with it, and I build it up, and then I can move it around, and it's more opaque than watercolor, and it almost feels like I'm working with oil, but not. And so I am going back and on top of stuff and just adding the highlights, and then I'm taking some out as I go and playing, and I go really slow. And he's over there, he's being so good. Yeah, hey buddy, he's being so good. And he just sits there, and then every once in a while he bites, and I have to move him. But right now I'm going to add some gouache over the top of the flower that I drew on this little piece of map. So whenever we travel and we stop at a rest area, I always look for free maps, and this is where I get my maps from. It's lovely. And then I dye them and use them in my journal and sketchbook. And the process is very meditative. The gouache is great. It really covers up things really well, but unlike acrylic, I can move it around. And when I do glazes with it, and this is not a glaze, I'm just packing it on. When I do glazes with it, I don't layer the gouache over gouache. I will layer it over other things like watercolor. In this case, that is a coffee stained map, and I have some pen and ink on it, and so it's going over there really well. And when I get to the area with the tape, I'm not too worried about it. Gouache will not stick to that tape. It'll come right off. And so if I get anything on it, I can just wipe it off. It is no big deal. Have to admit, my favorite part is popping the highlights on the middle of the flower. It really just boop, makes it come alive. And I'll rework these things again and again. So the midtone's there, and then I add the highlights. And if I want, I can go back and pop the darks. I'm just playing. One challenge when your sketchbook gets fatter is, what do you do with the corners and the cracks? Well, here's my suggestion for you. Keep on going. It's okay if it gets over the edge. It can become part of the next design. My other suggestion is to turn your sketchbook. It doesn't have to always point in the same direction. That way you can get better angles. You don't have to work with a paper all the way down flat all the time, but keep on turning it. You may find the brush stroke works better going one direction, or the pen one direction or the other. It's no big deal. A good design will look good from all directions. With that said, though, you don't have to have a good design in your sketchbook, in your journal. It is your journal. It doesn't matter. But I do like to turn my paper, and I do like to use different things to add stuff back in. I felt like the glitter was just too much, and so I've gone back with the gouache and kind of dulled it down. The beautiful thing about adding layers to your work is that if you have something that's too dark, you can go back and lighten it. So the gouache is working really beautifully for this. I am going back over these dark areas of my drawing. I really didn't like them very much, and adding some highlights and kind of taking out some of that dark where I feel like it got kind of crazy and jumbled. And it was therapeutic, but I don't like it on there, so I'm going to get rid of it. And I'm just going back and adding highlights to the leaf again on the other side. When the gouache is drying, because I have watered it down, it kind of loses some of its pop. And so going back over the top with a thicker layer helps to bring that back out. And there's one thing I have to do. Let's see if he's down there. Hey, buddy. He's being so good. He just sits there, and then I scratch his head, and then we just keep on going. He's a good bird. A few little more things at the bottom, just popping highlights. That's pretty much it. And every time I do, it just makes it come alive. And the only thing about string is that whenever you have put string or sewn into your work, it always seems to get in your way, no matter what you're doing. Going back over these highlights again and lightening the areas that just felt a little bit too dark. And once again, when the gouache dried, it got a little bit darker. So I'm adding some more. And now it's time for the pen. So this first one is water soluble. I haven't really decided which one I wanted to use. If I do hit this with water, it is going to bleed, but it's really dark and really juicy, and it just really makes the dark values pop. If I add this in there now for the low lights and the darkest values, I can go back later and hit it with a brush and make it bleed. Really like those darks, but I think what I'm going to do is I am going to switch to my ballpoint pen. The beauty of the ballpoints is that even though this is a cheap BIC ballpoint pen, when I do hatching, I can feather it out and it feels almost like I'm hatching with graphite. I can get some really soft values and I like it, and it rolls over that gouache beautifully. It doesn't stick as hot to things like acrylic, but over more textured surfaces, more matte surfaces like the gouache, watercolor, it works really well. It does get clogged every little bit, so every once in a while I have to take it and I'm bad. I use my hand and I just roll it on my hand, and what happens is it helps it start rolling again, or you can do a scrap piece of paper too, and then you can just keep on going. Just like when I do layers of gouache, I'm going to do the same thing with the pen. I pop some lines in, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to pop some more and really hammer those dark values. Help the edges out by going back and cutting into them with the pen, and it draws right over that gouache, and yeah, makes my brain happy. When you're creating in your sketchbook, if there's something you don't like, for instance, I made these pen marks too dark, and so now going back over the top with some gouache, I can lighten them. It's no big deal. Just work it into your artwork and keep on going. It doesn't have to be perfect, and what you might find, it turns out better than you thought. The same thing with here. I'm just adding in more hard lines and hatching and popping in some dark values. And then going back to my favorite part, popping the whites in the edges of this flower and hitting the middle too, because I can't resist it. I have a tendency never really to call anything done, so I'm just going to pop some more highlights here and there and then get to the point where I can let it go for now. I can always come back. Especially I'm thinking about adding some string, some more thread to it. But I think that's it. Gonna call it good. And then, look who climbed in my robe. Yeah, he's such a good birdie. If you enjoyed arting with me today, please subscribe. I plan to give more tips and hacks, but also I love to art, and I would love for you to join me. Have a great day and happy arting.